there it started, right? Right. So welcome everyone. So this is basically our third special interest group on multiphase flows and transport phenomena. So for those of you who are not aware of the special interest group, so this is a part of the UK Fluids Network, and we bid for a special interest group last year, I think, Giota, isn't it? And we bid for a special interest group on multiphase flows and transport phenomena, covering all aspects of multiphase flows, okay? Whether it's liquid, solid, liquid, gas liquid, or even miscible liquids or whatever it is, okay? Or miscible gases, okay? So anything to do with multi-component and multiphase flows, this is some sort of a home for you, okay? And so we have had about 3 workshops already, 3 SIG meetings as well. 2 ones as well. So the first one was a generic one wherein we decided on the types of focus groups we can have, experimental modeling, etc., application-specific printing, etc. The second one was on a poster session. So many of you also attended that, which was a very good one. And the third one is this one. So basically, this is a summer school for every one of us, everyone including academics, PhD students, postdocs, technicians, industry personnel, everyone, essentially on the types of experiments that are needed for multiphase flows and the types of experiments that are available for multiphase flows, and also data analysis, data analytical methods that are available. But at the same time, an important thing to see is this is actually a discussion forum, okay? So if you have issues concerning about your pressing experiments, probably one amongst all of us may have a solution, okay? And the other way around as well. If you want to alert someone about possible issues that may occur, please do, okay? So this is basically, we want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible. And to top it more, so we have named this particular summer school this is basically dedicated for Barry Azzopardi, who has been a professor at University of Nottingham, who had been a professor, who we are just about 1 year after his death. So basically this is a splendid tribute, I think, because he was one of the leading experimental fluid dynamicists of our time. And so an experimental summer school on his name is worthy honor. Okay, so with this, I would like to invite, I would like to ask Buddhi to speak a few words on Barry as a friend, as a colleague, and as a scientist as well. Thank you. And a mentor.
Guide me through, I never use these things.
You say you need to click the microphone down here, don't talk into it like a microphone. A lot of people see.
So this one is the first anniversary?
Yeah, anniversary. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. When we decided to have this summer school, Oma and Giota suggested this to be named, or Prashant using the email asking how we do it, and we decided to name it as Professor Barry Azzopardi Summer School for a good reason. This is home of Barry. Okay? Now, this is the man, those who haven't met him, and those who have met him, I don't have to put a photograph because everybody would remember him. He's an imposing character. Okay? So, I'm going to tell you about the man and his work very briefly, taking 10 minutes, because first death anniversary was 2 weeks ago. So, it's a fitting tribute to him. He's always looked like that, very serious person. His origins are not in the UK. He's from Gibraltar, and from his mother's side, he is connected to the UK. So that is why he is here. And that is how he introduces himself all the time as well. And then he makes jokes about his surname, like I do with mine. So he's schooled in Gibraltar, and did his A-levels. A-levels, according to him, is not very successful. So that is what, why can't I actually get the whole thing?
Because you've gone for widescreen now.
Ah, right. His teacher told everybody else who is going to read the recommendation letter that he will fit into within his limits. That is how he was introduced to UK. So he came with that recommendation and went to ICI in Teesside as a lab technician. So that is how he started as a lab technician. And then he went to Constantine School of Technology at the time, which became the Teesside University eventually, to do a part-time course to train as a lab technician at ICI. But his talent was identified by a professor there and asked him to register for a B.Tech degree, which he finished. And then one of his professors suggested that you should not stop here, do a PhD. And that is his starting point in multiphase flow, because his supervisor was lazy, a guy who published hundreds of papers in multiphase flow and who actually had worked at atomic energy research establishment at the time. So he recommended Barry to Jeff Hewitt, another big heavyweight in multiphase flow, and Barry started working for Jeff at, by the time it became, I think, AEA, Atomic Energy Agency, in multiphase flow lab. Now, that is around 1977. In 1990, he joined chemical engineering department here as the Lady Trent, aptly fitting title for a man looking like that. Lady Trent, Professor of Chemical Engineering. So, since 1990 until 2017, he has been a professor in Chemical Engineering Department. Right. Now, his main interest is, according to him, he has 3 wives, bubbles, droplets, and the one at home. Okay. And his wife called herself multiphase flow widow, because Barry actually married to multiphase flow, and then she's the one who prepared his dinner. So he's so much dedicated to multiphase flow. He started to build a lab here to do large scale multiphase flow experiments. And his reasoning for that one is that with the small scale 1-inch pipes and water and air, we build models which may or may not fit into industrial scale operations. And he was proven to be correct on that one. So he started working on large pipes and has published about 150 papers. That is how we wrote about him in Multiphase Journal. But after that, I was intrigued by this, and I wanted to find out how many papers he has written. Apparently, he has written 221 papers and so many book chapters and a book. And then I started counting his conference papers, which I'm still doing. So I don't know how many conference papers he has presented. So he has been busy. In his work, he's an experimental fluid dynamicist, so all his work is experimental. What he was looking is, 1, fidelity. Secondly, he's very keen on getting very accurate measurements. For that reason, he is not only experimenting in multiphase flow, he collaborated with many measurement technique developing groups. As a result, we have something called wire mesh sensor, was developed in Germany, but in collaboration with Barry here. And then he worked with a capacitance tomographic company, developing the tools to get the required resolution And we are still using those techniques in our labs. And he has kind of put the foundation in getting more accurate data with the uncertainty of those data assessed properly. So that is his way of thinking. And then when the summer school was suggested, we decided to look into things like analysis of uncertainties and how to make sense out of those things. And then what are the analytical methods we can use building on from what Barry did and following what he did as well. So throughout today and tomorrow, you will go through this kind of explanations. Of course, we expect you to join in as well. This is a knowledge sharing environment, not that anybody going to preach you about how we do things and you should follow. So this is a collaborative event. Hopefully, we can do some justice to his thought by doing that. Thank you, guys. Oh.
So next in line. Yeah. So the next item on the agenda essentially is breaking the ice. So virtually it means that. What would be great would be that if you could just at your place, you don't need to stand up or anything, just say what your name is and what you want from the workshop and what are you working on. Okay. If you're a PhD student, say this is what I'm working on and I'm going to use these methods, or I'm looking to use these methods to study this. Okay. If you're a developer of instruments, do say what type of instruments do you develop. If you're industry, you say, oh, I have worked on these methods or whatever. So it's up to you. So essentially, it's just an icebreaker. And can someone make quick notes on how this is? Because we want to collect this and possibly share it with everyone towards the outcome of the workshops. At least people will know who they are, who they have spoken to, etc. Okay? So I'll just start with me. I'm Prof. Valluri from University of Edinburgh. I'm essentially a modeler, but I do collaborate a lot with experimentalists to identify, say, instabilities or to identify phenomena. And these are essentially multiphase flows. I work on interfacial flows, so I look at the interface very carefully because all my models also predict the nature of the interface. So that is my objective. My objective of this workshop is to learn what methods can be used to exploit certain phenomena which I would like to see. So do you want to start? Yeah. Yeah.
My major is in modeling.
Give your name and your affiliation. Yeah.
So my name is Chen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in Nottingham University.
Okay.
And, my major is multiphase flow modeling. Use vector non-vector. And I think it's very helpful to know and collaborate with experimentalists in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And future can be thankful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Huddersfield University. I lead a small group, which is known as Angeli Missions and the Environment Research Group. There's about 30 members in there. I initially trained as a multiphase person. I did my PhD on solid liquid flows. Later on, throughout my career, as things developed, I diversified quite a lot. And that resulted in oil water flows, air water flows, and all that. Again, because now I'm quite senior age-wise, I think I've not only limited to only experiments, but we have started working on experiments, modeling, as well as development of instruments. So one of the strengths of my group, is not very, very big, but is on inclusive probes, reference inclusive probes. And apart from not clear.
Do you want to say?
Hello, Editya from the Department of Nottingham. This is my
Can you raise your voice a bit? Yeah. Can you raise your voice a bit? Sorry.
This is my third year, and I'm also doing some modeling work with light dispersal professor. Currently, I'm doing some powder water separation flow activity, some modeling for water droplets, also on sort hydrophobic surfaces.
Hi everyone, my name is Phil Wong. I'm a postdoc from the University of Leeds. I'm working in modeling and simulation of droplets and soft particles in fluid. I attended the summer school in order to know more about experiments, especially how can I set up simulations to better compare with the experiments.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yanis. I work at the University of Birmingham as a PhD student. I do microfluidics. I do dynamics and pattern management and control interfaces at droplet formation. And mainly it's looking for the suggestions, like all these new ideas that we work.
Hi, I'm Cyrus, and I'm an PhD student at the University of Birmingham as well. I'm currently using PIV to try to characterize fluid flow in my high-shape mixer. It's mostly single phase at the moment, but eventually I'd like to extend that to multi-phase. Basically, I'm here just to look at how to improve on data analysis and looking at the data.
Hi, my name is Azzopardi. I'm a PhD student here. I'm a theoretical modeler, and I'm looking at multiphase flow in an engineering application called Valluri, which is I'm mainly here just to find out different methods of verification that I can do for my models.
Do you want to start from there?
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an undergraduate here at the University of Nottingham. I've just started a research program with Buddhika, so I've just got to check her about anything at once. So.
I'm Giota. I'm a postdoc from Oxford. So I'm looking at controlling highly dynamic stability in a conformable system. My work is mostly experimental. The thing I know enough
biology of stress materials, but in my PhD I'm working on how to clean viscoplastic soils due to surfaces using water jets, which is a multiphase flow problem. We have the interface between the liquid fuel and the soil, and I want to learn a little bit more about how I can use these techniques on my work.
Hi, I'm my brother. I'm a research fellow at the University of Leeds, Department of Chemical Engineering, and I'm working on modeling discrete element
background is electronic engineering, so I developed the theory and instrument of electrical tomography. So also I'm doing experiment on multi-phase flow using electrical tomography. So the experiments mainly are solid gas, solid, and liquid. So I will tell more details in my talk afternoon. So I'm here to exchange ideas and learn from peers like latest research program. Also, the challenges and problems, like how can I link my electrical tomography with all other colleagues' research.
Do you want to start? Yes, yes.
Hello, I'm Ivan Brazil. I come from Dynamics, a company that manufactures systems for measurements in fluid dynamics, namely PIV, radiates, and so on. Well, before that, I used to work at Imperial College at TMF2, doing research on fast liquid and liquid flows. And I'm here to talk about more.
Hi, myself Aditya Karnik. I am a research associate at Imperial College right now, but I'll be moving to Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen as a lecturer soon. My background is purely simulation, so I've been working on simulations of dispersed particulate flows. I'm here mainly to learn about the experimental techniques and how they can be exploited for validation of my simulations.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Prof. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Nottingham in stuff, studying asymmetric drag of swimming. Although my work involves single-phase flow using PID techniques, I'm interested in swimmers' interaction with water interface. Therefore, looking for very old new ways of water interface.
I'm a postdoctoral in Nottingham. I was also one of the last students of Azzopardi. I did my PhD in gas and liquid. I work a lot in experimental analysis of data. And now I'm working with big data and setting up a database of thousands of experiments of the University of Nottingham and other universities. And my interest is to learn more about data analysis.
Hello, my name is Azzopardi. I'm a physical engineering technical specialist at the University of Nottingham. I also largely meter pipes, and I still do some experiments in multiphase flow and network and look at the result from asymmetry and hoping to understand that more.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrew. I'm from Imperial College London, Chemical Engineering Department. I'm a PhD student working on multiphase flows, actually the vector subtractor of multiphase flows, particularly gas-liquid systems. And my interest closely relates to laser diagnostic techniques, so I'm sure we can raise some of the important matters today around this topic.
Hi, my name is João Vasques. I'm a postdoc at the University of Nottingham. I'll be applying laser-based techniques to investigate oil flows in various aero engine components for Rolls-Royce. My PhD was applying these laser-based techniques to investigate the facial gas liquid flows in pipes. My motivation to come here is to keep up to date with current experimental and modern techniques to discuss some of the issues that I'm probably going to face and to show everyone around briefs if you can find it.
My name is Rahili. I'm a postdoc at UCL. I use PIVLIF to characterize the flow fields in multiphase flows. And I'm here to learn new experimental techniques to characterize multiphase flows.
Hi, I'm David Han. I'm an academic here at the University of Nottingham. My expertise is really in optical measurement techniques, which I've used in a wide range of applications, acoustics, waterways, multiphase fluids. Barry pulled me into multiphase fluids back a number of years ago, and I've been looking at things like PID, looking at interfacial shear stress, the interface, and other applications like that.
Good. So we have a new person who just came in. So sorry to put you on the spot, but if you can just let us know your name and where you're coming from and what do you expect from this workshop and what are you working on?
Yeah, Walter Hammer from University of Valluri, second year PhD student, and looking at fluid mechanics in dishwashers. So I'm hoping to get a bit more information on data analysis.
Okay. Good. So that's finished for this. And I know that there are several people who are expected because there are very good speakers who are coming up now. So there's one person from Sulzer who's coming and who's going to be giving a talk as well. And there's another one, Brian Peterson, who's on his way, he just mentioned. So he's also going to give a talk on, he's going to be giving a talk on volumetric PIV and stuff. So they are expected, so they're on their way. So with this, I would just like to invite Giota to just give an overview of experiments in multiphase flows. So as you see, we have a length and breadth of expertise here, and length of breadth of wish list as well. Okay, so hopefully the workshop is quite informal, so please feel free to ask questions because that's what it is all about. And hopefully you get something out by the end of tomorrow.
Okay, let's try that. I think I do have a loud voice as well. I'm usually teaching very large lecture theatre, so I'm using my voice alone. Tell me if it's too loud. Thank you, everybody, and welcome as well. This is, as Prof mentioned, one of the events we try to organize, we are organizing within this multi-phase special interest group, and the first summer school. So let's see how it works out, and hopefully it can continue in the future. The title of my talk is Experimental Techniques in Multiphase Flows. I should say here that I will focus more on liquid-liquid systems because I will base this talk on the work we've mainly done in my career, in my group. A lot of the techniques, of course, can be applied to other systems as well. And we'll have a lot of opportunities to discuss this, hopefully at the end of the talk, during all the breaks, and later on. I'm in the Thames Multiphase Group at the Department of Chemical Engineering at University College London. Before I continue, I would just like to say a couple of words for Barry as well. I met Barry when I was doing my PhD. He was an expert in the area. I did my PhD in London at Imperial, but there was always collaboration between the multiphase experts in the UK. It's a big community, but maybe not as big. So we do know each other. We tend to know each other. And we actually met again, of course, over our careers and years. And I should say that in the last few years, we had a project together with Barry. It was a pleasure and actually very important and beneficial to be working with him. I always remember him as somebody that was very kind, very thorough, and somebody that always had the time to discuss and to raise important questions. So everything had to be discussed. Data points, whenever right or wrong, had to be looked at. Let's hope this course in his memory can continue in the future. So let's see how these things work now. Great. So what I'm going to do, as I said, is that I will, in a way, go through research work we have done, focusing on liquid-liquid flows, but actually covers a whole range of scales. And starting from large-scale pipeline flows, small-scale channel flows or microfluidics, And in between these is the various important phenomena, interfacial phenomena, that define the flow characteristics in all these scales, phenomena such as coalescence and breakup. And I will end up my talk with this, a few slides on these intensified separations and reactions, is where we don't just look at the flow characteristics of the systems, but use them as well to have in chemical engineering systems, in process engineering systems, where there are other things happening, such as mass transfer reaction or separations. The application areas, perhaps I don't need to persuade you, are many. Oil and gas is a very important one. Nuclear, actually, they do say the multiphase flow, especially on pipelines, started from nuclear very long time ago, where Barry and a number of other people started, and recently has gone back to nuclear. So nuclear is nowadays quite important. But also this last part here, that is very interesting and very complex as well, is the processing of complex products for a number of different industries, fast-moving consumer goods, all the detergents, the cosmetics, food that we are using involve multiphase mixtures. So I'll start from large-scale flows, where the interest is usually to study the characteristics of what we call the different flow patterns. I have pictures later on. But also what is very important for the industry is to know how to predict the transitions, the changes. So this means understanding the physical phenomena that lead from one flow pattern to the other. What we have been studying is these different patterns, the separated, the dispersed, and the in-between. And also the transitions, particularly from separated to dispersed, and the other way around, from dispersed to separated. And part of it, of course, is understanding phenomena such as breakage of drops, because it leads to dispersed patterns, and coalescence of drops, because it leads from dispersed to separated flows, and it's important for settlers, for coalescers. That's the applications. It's a lot more. Very obvious ones in oil flow assurance, of course, oil flows in pipelines, as mixtures with other phases, separator design, the pumping and energy requirements of these systems. What we have been doing recently, so this is something that is actually not an experimental instrument, but it's actually a tool we have developed to help us study the flow pattern transitions, is that we have started thinking at ways of actuating different flow patterns, so we have a bit more control on when they appear, and we can study them better. And of course, they can eventually be used if we are interested in a particular flow pattern. If people do experiments and do experiments in flows, in pipes, they may have come across systems like that. This is a typical flow loop. This is a schematic of a flow loop of the two flow loops we have at UCL. It's the same in many other universities. And in Nottingham, I think you're having some fabulous facilities that we'll be showing to people later on. So it's two fluids, oil and water in this case, stored. There is a long test section. The longer the better, we are told, but then we have building limitations. And the fluids return. In this case, the loop is closed, so they go to a separator, they separate, and they go back to their storage tanks. What I will talk a bit more now is the various instruments we use to study these flows. Of course, in any flow loop, we would have pressure transducers, a very essential thing. Something that comes from the olden days is these quick closing valves. It was one of the first things people used to study hold-up of volume fraction in various parts of the pipes, where you just simply close the valves and you measure the amount, the volume of the water there. We've moved on since then, but this is still a very nice way of validating, comparing with other instruments, validating your data, and getting some measurements as well. What I have here is also, we'll talk about these instruments in a minute. I have these fluids that we have been using. Some of the results I'll show you have been carried out with these fluids, tap water, because we are talking about a lot of water here, and this type of oil, actually the 140. some experiments, mainly in our other flow facility, have been carried out with this combination of fluids. And the reason we use those is that we can match the refractive index of the oil phase with the water phase. And this is very important if we want to carry out PIV, LIF in highly mixed flows, dispersed flows, or flows with very complex interfaces. So we'll see how that goes. So let's go first to, okay, first of all, some first results everybody gets when they have to study two-phase systems. Some high-speed imaging and the flow patterns. What sort of flow patterns do we get for different volume fractions and mixture velocities? This is a typical flow pattern map for horizontal flows here. So we have stratified flows down here. Then mixing starts, which we call this type of pattern, we call it dual continuous flows, because we have both phases, the water and the oil continuous, but mixing, a lot of dispersed drops. And then depending on at higher velocities and depending on the fraction of the oil in this case, we will have dispersions of oil in water or dispersions of water in oil. And if we impose some inclination to the pipe, the boundaries, the transitions of these patterns change. And actually, in inclined flows, we manage to see some plug flows in our system, in this area here. So a lot of different flow patterns, and we need a lot of different techniques to study them. As you can see here in stratified flows, stratified wavy flows, the interfaces, there is not much mixing, so we can actually get a lot of things just from visual imaging, visual high-speed imaging. But once we get to this sort of patterns, we still see, or probably we think we see what's the pattern, but it's much more difficult to extract any more information. What's the drop size? If we get in this case here, we are sometimes not sure just from visual observations whether there is a water layer on the bottom or all the water is dispersed. And this can be important for pressure drop, can be important for corrosion, or for other things that are of interest. So we need other instruments as well to study these types of flows. And I'll start with these conductance probes because they are the ones, all these PIV LIF techniques are more recent in a way. They're used a lot, but as we will discuss in a minute, there are also a lot of limitations. So all these conductivity techniques are a bit older, and there are various ways of applying them, of using them. I'll show you a few here. We use these ring probes. They are used a lot in gas-liquid flows as well, and they are very important for, in gas-liquid, in liquid-liquid flows, are quite important for getting, for example, the interface height here, or more precisely for getting the wetted perimeter of the wall, the wetted by water perimeter of the wall. Another reason we use it is because it allows us to know in dispersed flows whether there is, if it is this pattern here, if we have any water in contact with the wall. If the whole system is oil continuous, then of course we don't get a signal from this probe. Dual wire conductance probe, what it does is that it gives us the height of the interface in separated flows, gas-liquid or liquid-liquid. Liquid-liquid, the oil is non-conductive, the water is conductive, especially if you use tap water in London, and that gives us enough difference, conductivity difference to record it. We also developed this sort of conductance probe. People that work with emulsions, they might know the conductance probes you can actually buy. In our case, we had to make it to have a smaller size. In this case, we just have 2 wires, and we did this here so we could increase the interfacial area in the flow. But this allows us to know which phase is continuous at this point in the pipe. And for all water dispersion, this can be important. And again, moving up, we can have electrical resistance tomography systems. You might be aware with these tomographic systems. For resistance tomography, we have to use pins like these ones or metal probes. which are actually in contact. They're flush with the inside wall of the pipe, but they are in contact with the fluid. There is the equivalent in capacitance probes. There might be some, you will see them also in the lab here in Nottingham. But these resistance probes are right for having an oil-water flow, and as long as you don't exceed certain concentrations. Again, the good thing with that is that we could make the probes ourselves, so we could actually adjust them based on our pipe size, pipe diameter. So I'll show you some results here. Don't concentrate so much on the results because the talk, and I thought this summer school is more about techniques, measuring techniques. But for example, using this, let's say, suite of probes, what we managed to find is to investigate very well a phenomenon that is very important in liquid-liquid flows, which is phase inversion. Phase inversion is when you have one phase dispersed into the other, and then because of some change, either the power you put in or the volume fraction of the phase, the dispersion inverts, and the other phase, the previously dispersed phase, becomes continuous. So in this experiment here, we start with water continuous dispersions. We decrease the amount of water or increase amount of the oil, and this is what happens in the pipe. That's how the dispersion in the pipe changes. So in the beginning, we have a dispersion. And what we do is that we have a number of probes that help us check the conductivity at various parts of the pipe. So this is the ring probe, so we know what happens at the pipe periphery. This is just a probe I showed you, which is the two wires, so we can measure at different parts of the pipe. So we can have some measurements in the center and at the pipe top. So when, in this case here, we have a water continuous dispersion, all the oil is dispersed, all these probes give us high conductivity values. As we increase the amount of oil, what we see is that at some point, first in the center here, and then on the upper part of the pipe, the water inverts and becomes dispersed now, and the oil becomes continuous. That's why the conductivity values are low. However, this value remains high. This is the conductivity values at the whole periphery of the pipe, which means there is still some water in contact with the wall. So we have some water layer that takes actually quite a lot of oil to get rid of. So we need to have about 80% oil, 20% water to manage to really disperse this part of the water and to go to this flow pattern. So using this combination of probes, we managed to monitor how this, by changing the volume fraction of one phase, how the distribution changes in the pipe and which one is the continuous phase. So I should say here, these experiments, we had our pipe here, and we just introduced the two fluids with the T-junction in the pipe. It's a common way to carry out experiments in two-phase flows. It may not be the best way sometimes for the modelers, because the conditions on the pipe entry may not be as well defined. You may need to actually go and model the flows of the fluids beforehand to be able to actually to well represent the inlet. And these are some results from the ERT probe, again repeating the same experiment. Again, as we increase this is the water fraction, as we decrease the water fraction, this is the images we get. In the beginning, we just have a water and continuous phase, and you see, as we go on, we increase the amount of oil. And DRT also tells us that there is always a bit of water staying at the bottom that is very difficult to disperse. This can be quite important. The difference is that we can actually, we have looked at that as well, so you can actually read the values locally. So if you have an ERT system, maybe you can get rid of all these other probes because you can read locally the values of the conductivity values, and then know whether at some point in the pipe you have a water, an oil, or a water continuous phase. So what I said is that in the previous slides, we just had a simple inlet in our pipe, and we let the flow develop. What we also wanted to do, though, is to find ways to what we call actuate the flow patterns, so we make the patterns happen when we want them. So, for example, this is a Y inlet junction This is the oil, this is the water. And what we get here is that if we want to move from stratified to some type of dispersed flows, we have to go to quite high velocities. And in a way, when you look at this transition, what you really want to know is when drops start detaching from the waves, the interfacial waves. If we do that like this, we have to be a bit lucky to know where to look in the pipe to see when drops detach and try to study them, study the mechanism of drop detachment. So what we decided to do, and I don't know if that is running as a video, okay, is that we introduced perhaps you can see it a little bit more here. So this is the pipe vertical diameter, let's say, water here, oil here. We introduced a cylinder, a bluff body, in the pipe, in the water phase, and then because there is behind the bluff body there would be von Karman vortices forming, which would interact with the interface and cause locally a lot of waves. And we see here some results for different conditions. Actually, this is for the same condition in these different instances. So having done that, this is looking at the bottom of the pipe, the bluff body somewhere here, the cylinder. We managed to activate, to have waves in a very well-defined region after the bluff body, and also to observe. So if you look at this video here, we have started having drop detachment. Okay, you have to go back, isn't it? There you are. So you have some drop detachment at this point here, which is very convenient if you do an experiment, so you don't need to have cameras that follow the flow, but they're happening at your field of view in a way. So these are some PIV results now from this system, and we see the velocity profiles. And what we have managed to do, it's a topic of another talk perhaps, is to, because we can calculate, we know the frequency of the von Karman vortices, we found that the frequency, the interfacial waves have the same frequency. So we have a bit more control on how the interface breaks into drops. So what we have here, and this is another probe, again a conductivity probe. So in this case, what we do is that we try to generate the dispersion at the inlet and then see how it separates downstream. This is to start the transition from dispersed to separated flows. And we use for that a dual conductivity, dual conductance probe. But actually, the probe, each probe tip, each sensor looks like this. So there is an inner and an outer electrode. And whenever, for example, if we have this sort of configuration with water as the continuous phase and oil as dispersed drops, every time the signal is high, and every time a drop is passing and is blocking this or bridging both these sensors, we'll have a drop in the signal. And this continues. If we use two of those sensors, as we do here, then we can cross-correlate them. Okay, we find the delay time, and then we can also use that to calculate drop size. So with the signal from one sensor, we can get volume fraction. So you see here some data post-processing. We have the actual signal. The raw signal is the blue, and then we need to have some thresholding to get rid of the noise, and we get a typical square wave, which we can use to know at this point here in the pipe where the probe is, what is the local volume fraction. If we now have two of these signals and we cross-correlate them between the first and the second electrode, we can also use this time and the distance between these electrodes to calculate the drop velocity, and from that and the raw signal to get the drop size. Okay, so. Okay, so what you have, this is the signal from one probe. So what this gives you is that the time the water phase, or perhaps I should say the oil phase, is in contact with the probe. So this signifies one drop, this signifies the second drop, third, and so on. So we have this time signal. Now, if we have two of these, one from one probe and one from the other, and we cross-correlate them, we can find the time delay. How long does it take for a drop, for example, to go from one probe to the other? Okay. So, yeah, so we know the drop velocity, which means we know how fast the drop goes through this gap here. And if we know the velocity and the time, we can calculate the size of one drop. And so we can get different drop sizes looking at this signal here. So you need two of these sensors to get the cross-correlation. One sensor would give you the volume fraction. So at this point in the pipe, it took so long, over time, we have so much of the time was spent by oil and so much of the time was spent by water. And their ratio gives us the ratio of the two phases at this point in the pipe. Yeah?
Don't the drops move around the probe? So the probe is breaking the drops?
No, I mean, all these are assumptions, but if you have if you have very large bubbles, usually, that are more deformable, you can think about issues on breakage. When you have liquid drops, you don't really. All depends on this one. If you cannot cross-correlate, it means that you cannot cross-correlate. The drops move in the opposite direction. Your two sensors have to look at the way of the direction of the flow. So a drop that sees the one sensor, then will see the next sensor. But if
what is seen, and how does the drop hit on the sensor? Like, does the sensor breaks the drop and goes in there?
No, the drop goes around. There is a lot of work on what you measure. There might be some hysteresis on the drop arriving on the sensor. Maybe it doesn't, the sensor doesn't break the interface straight away. Maybe it deforms the interface. The other thing is that if you have always to think about the size of the sensor compared to the size of your drop, so there would be limitations there. So these have to be taken into account. And of course, if you use a sensor like that, you will have to have some other technique to validate it. What we have done in our case with this one is that we looked at cases where we could actually also measure the drops. For example, in small, low volume fractions, not so large velocities, and to see how far our photographs and our sensor results are comparable. Of course, when you use a technique, maybe this is a nice thing to discuss, you always have to be thinking what you are measuring. Okay, and we can stay on that more now or at the end. Yeah, I'll answer that. Because if you look at optical techniques, you will be seeing a certain part of the pipe, which is usually what is close to you. If you use sensors like that, you will be looking at a different location in the pipe. So this is one thing to have in mind. The other thing, I might need to do that over break, is that when a drop, use my fingers, when a drop hits the sensor, it might hit it bang in the middle, or maybe we'll only see a part of it. So you don't see the diameter of the drop, but a chord of the drop. So this is also, the data post-processing is also very important. What you really measure with these sensors is drop chord lengths. How do you go from there to the actual drop size? Would need some further data post-processing. A lot of techniques that measure drop sizes, even commercial ones, actually do that, measure drop chord lengths. And then you can either live with this as information, that this is an indication of the size of the drops in the system, or you can do, actually, Ben is very good to talk a lot more about that. You can try to use some post-processing techniques to go from chord length to drop size, using certain assumptions. So it's, I would say, it is a direct measurement, but you have to really think what you're measuring. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for the very detailed discussion on this. I just wanted to mention that there's a wealth of information available on uses of reference probe using cross-correlation. That is not the only technique that we can use actually the function of bubble through the probe to get you signals. Because I've worked in this particular thing, we have to work on dual sensor probe, then we have worked on 4 sensor probe.
That's very correct. Yeah.
Two-dimensional velocity, as well as for symmetrical bubbles, we can get bubble size as well. The recent work that some of my students have done is they have been able to get the shape of the irregular shape bubbles using the practice flow.
Yeah.
That is so it's not only cross correlation. By increasing number of sensors, you can get full variables from there. There's an issue of intrusiveness. There's an issue of interaction that we have to deal with, but it can give you almost all the information that is needed if you scale it.
That's very true. Thank you for this. And there is a various probe configurations, and the literature is very wide, but that doesn't mean that is an easy technique to just use. You really have to think what you're measuring and what sort of information you try to take out of your system. So this is for the conductance probes, and what I want to show you here is how complex the flows become once the velocities increase. So here you have this dispersion, and this is an inlet we use to produce these dispersed flows. It's somebody called it a Christmas tree. What it is actually is one phase, the water in this case, goes on the outside, and the oil comes through a lot of nozzles from the inside. So we make dispersed flows in the beginning. And for us as well, this was one good way to try to talk a bit closer with the modelers, because in this case we do produce dispersions. We can start with a dispersed inlet and see how the flow develops. But if you move further down now, there would be a dispersed flow that, apart from very close to the pipe, you cannot really know what's happening inside. So what we did is that we tried also to use techniques such as PIV and LIF to study these more complex flows. But of course, in that case, we are limited by the types of liquids, in this case, we can use. This is the setup of our system. And it's sort of a standard one. It involves, in that case, a high-speed camera and a continuous laser, because we are also interested in the evolution of the time evolution of the phenomena. Some specifications here. We did use rhodamine particles, and also we used a little bit of a dye in the water phase to just make sure we capture the interface very well. Some results now. So this is what we see now in the flows with the black bodies. So this is this black hole here is the black body, the cylinder. This is an image in the middle of the pipe. This is the direction of the flow. Aqueous phase with the seeding and the dye and the organic phase. And you just see how the interface gets worse in a way as we increase the velocities or the flow rates. So something like that could be studied quite well with high-speed imaging. When you reach this point here, the images get quite more complex. So you get a better idea, better picture of what happens with techniques like this one. And this is a velocity profile. And what I have here, and trying to link a little bit with the modeling talk that will follow, is a 2D numerical modeling of flow past the cylinder. So the way we worked in this case is that we we could actually play a lot with the frequency of the waves by changing the size of the cylinder. So we used CFD to design our experimental system. We used CFD in single phase flows actually, and 2D, so we didn't have to run very long simulations to find out what sort of vortex frequencies did we get. Based on that, for various sizes of the cylinders. Based on these CFD experiments, we made our experiments, we designed our cylinders, because as people know, experimentalists, it takes a very long time to make something in your university workshops, so we cannot just say, go and ask them to do something and expect it to be ready the next day. And based on these simpler CFD simulations, we designed our experimental system. And of course, this was good as well for some validation of our experimental results, because then we could compare these results with the simulations and in a way, let's say, calibrate both or check both. This is just a graph that shows that by adding the cylinders, so this is the flow patterns we get if we just put the two phases together. And this is what happens when we introduce the cylinder. So this is the transition line when we don't have anything in the flow. All this is stratified. When we start adding cylinders, we reduce the region of stratified flow to this little area. So we managed to actuate the flow. Quite interesting is also this type of flow. In this case here again, we had an actuator in the beginning of the pipe, so we introduced a dispersion in the pipe, and you see what happens a little bit further down here. So this is quite a complex system. We have water drops in this case. Oops, go back. Yeah, play that again. Water drops in this case in oil. The dark thing is oil. And what you see, if that plays as well, no. What I was going to show you is that this is quite a powerful technique because in a way it allows us, I can try to play that later, but basically we managed to also capture coalescence phenomena of these drops. Actually this drop goes on and coalesces with this interface, which is very interesting. This is actually, this sort of approach allows us to go into the details of the physical phenomena that happen in our system. So some information we have extracted from these measurements. This is water continuous dispersions. The black holes is oil drops. We've published a paper on that one. There is a lot more information, but you can get a lot of things out of images like that. The drop size, the velocity of the drops, because it's time-resolved measurements. You can get the velocity profiles of the phases. And this is the opposite pattern, where now the drops, this is the water drops in the oil. So I'll switch a little bit here. What I want to say is that in all these transitions, phenomena that are important is the breakage of drops from waves, or the coalescence of drops here, for example, with layers for the flow pattern that make the flow pattern changes happen. So we look, we now go down a little bit the scales, and we have put a lot of effort on studying coalescence. In our case, it is mainly coalescence of drops with flat interfaces. This is sort of a limiting case of having a drop with another drop. It's also useful on its own. And we have looked at a number of different approaches to study this coalescence phenomenon. Applications are in flow pattern transitions, as we said, separations in settlers, emulsion stability, when we want to form structured products with emulsions, again, with drops inside. So here I show you a summary of the techniques. This might be this one, actually. Sorry, the pump is noisy. We studied the coalescence in first 3D cells, where, so it is coalescence of a drop with a non-moving still interface. So we have the drop approaching the interface and coalescing with it. In this case, because the cell is 3D, we used more classical PIV, so we have a laser plane going through the drop, a high-speed camera in this case, to observe the coalescence of the drop with the interface. For various reasons, but also because it is important, we also looked at the coalescence of a drop with an interface, but in a thin LSO cell. One of the reasons was that the coalescence phenomenon was a bit slowed down, or a lot slowed down, and that allowed us to capture some phenomena that can be very fast, which is the very beginning of coalescence. And what we are looking now is this coalescence of a drop with a moving water film, and you see it happening here. And at the moment we are doing that with high-speed imaging, but the plan is to try to do something more sophisticated with one of the techniques here. I should say here, yeah, I didn't mention that in this case we use classical PIV, which is a laser and a camera. In this case, because the cell is thin, what we used is not a laser, we used backlight to illuminate the tracer particles inside inside the water phase and get our velocity profiles. Let's see some images, results of that. I don't know what works now. Yeah, so we studied this is the 3D configuration, this is the 2D configuration, and actually this is a very nice phenomenon, which is the partial coalescence, where you have a series of drops forming, and it's very beautiful, it's very nice, but also can be very detrimental, because it means you end up with different sizes of drops. So the PIV allows us to get results like this. So these results in the 3D cell is by using the laser. these results here in the 2D cell is by using the backlights. And these results are actually, apart from nice, because you get the velocity profiles and all these interesting flow lines here, actually showed us something that modelers had shown before, that when you have surfactants in your system, then what happens is that at the very early stages of coalescence here, it seems that the surfactant concentration at this point here is higher, is almost doubled. And it's something that there are papers out that claim that they've shown, modelers have shown that, but it was one of the first times we managed to show that experimentally by studying these PIV images. And now I don't have any images from that. People are trying to use fluorescent surfactants as well to actually see where exactly the surfactants are and try to see what actually happens with the concentration of surfactants. It's very important for stability of emulsions, but also a very interesting physical problem. What we have down here, if these work, is Newtonian fluids, and we see what happens to the coalescence phenomenon when we increase the amount of xanthan gum in the water phase. So it's a shear thinning fluid, more viscous also than water. And here you see some some velocity profiles from the PIV images. So you see here, this is the tracer particles illuminated with the backlight, not with the laser. So they are not fluorescent. They are not fluorescing. Might be fluorescent. What's interesting here, again, from a fundamental point of view, is that as the meniscus expands, you get very strong extensional flows. So all these Newtonian properties of the fluids can be very important if you have extensional viscosities. Moving again down the scales, going now, and this will be the last part of my talk, is the small channel flows, microfluidics, for various applications. They've been used a lot. They are being used a lot for structured products like double emulsions, also a lot in inkjet printing, where you have drops forming and then depositing a substrate, and you may or may not have coalescence. In enhanced oil recovery, actually microfluidic systems are used sometimes as models of the pores because they have small dimensions. And also in microanalysis, a lot of these systems started as a nice, neat way to carry out fast, very small quantities analysis, the so-called microtasks, microanalytical systems. They are now used also a lot in what we call intensified processing, although there are different issues on how do you scale up, how intensified can you get by increasing the size. So a lot of applications. And of course, it's again two-phase flows in channels, so we are interested in flow characteristics. One particular pattern that people are looking a lot is this plug flow pattern, where the drops are a bit larger than the channel size, also drop flow pattern. And there we again look at either Newtonian fluids or, but also at mass transfer. So some maps, some typical flow patterns. You can get those quite easily with imaging. You do need microscopes at this stage. And again, I'll show you, I'll spend a little bit of time in this system here, which is a particle image velocimetry system we developed to study velocity profiles, but in both phases at the same time. So there have been some other approaches. What we did is that we used one laser and we split the beam of this laser. The beam was then guided to a microscope, and here this is where our test section is. So I'll start from here. So we have different particles in the aqueous and in the organic phase. Some description of the system. We have within the microscope we have a dichroic mirror to reflect the laser beam. So only the light reflected by the particles is captured, and then the light from the particles is going inside this beam splitter, and another dichroic mirror lets the red light go to one camera, and the blue light is reflected to another camera. So we have two cameras, one for each phase, two different types of particles, and what we manage is to get the velocity profiles in both phases. there was a lot of challenges. Can talk a lot about that. It's not so easy to get particles in organic phases. We did need to add some dye to be able to see the interface. You lose a lot of energy because of dichroic mirrors. And of course, in the end, there is a lot of post-processing because you have two different cameras, different resolutions, and so on. And especially, another problem was that this blue light is actually less energetic. And yeah, we have to make sure that we are able to capture it. The signal is not always so good. But some results from that. This is work we've done in collaboration with Birmingham, actually. And there is already a paper out on some of the results, and we hope to have another one soon. And this is drop formation now with surfactants for controlled drop formation. So this is what you see. And this is now the flow fields in both phases that you can actually capture at the same time. And you see now the velocity profile within this drop. This is the aqueous drop. We've done the same with non-Newtonian fluids. In this case, this is our non-Newtonian aqueous phase, and this is the oil phase. And what is interesting here is that, which is important if you have non-Newtonian fluids, is that this here is the viscosity inside this phase. You have high shear on the wall, and the viscosity is low, while in the middle, the viscosity can get higher. Of course, in these channels, as we said, you can also get a lot of imaging using the microscopes. And there are a lot of important characteristics, like the film thickness. People study that a lot. Or if I move to the next image, I'll do that later. Yeah, film thickness, and also the size of the plugs. That is very important if you start having mass transfer operations then in these systems, because you really need to know your interfacial area, how big the plugs and the slugs are to develop your mass transfer models. And as I said, I'll show you in the end some applications where we have actually done mass transfer in these small channel flows. And this is a slightly different system, because what we wanted to do here is to use this plug flow to do extraction, to do a separation. And actually the separation we were interested in was relevant to spent nuclear fuel reprocessing. So we did separation of uranium from a nitric acid solution, where your spent fuel would be, to an organic phase. So we could have studied the system, the hydrodynamics of the system, using all these lasers we mentioned before. But it's much more easy, especially if you have to work with your uranium and nitric acid in fume cabinets, to have a simpler system. So in this case, we did use the camera backlight, so we did a bright field PIV shadowgraphy to get the information on the geometric characteristics of the plugs and on the velocity profiles. So yeah, another type of information you can get is these circulation patterns inside the plugs that are used a lot. Actually, one of the benefits of this plug flow is that it enhances a lot the mixing within the two phases. And this is one way to quantify this enhancement, because you can get the circulation time, which in a way gives you an idea of how fast the phases mix in the plug, which is this one, or in the slug. And last but not least is some other mass transfer study we've done again in this plug flow, where we now, as I said, we try to do separations, extractions, because they involve two liquid phases for metals and also for applications relevant to spent nuclear fuel reprocessing. We've worked with uranium, but also with lanthanides, and one of them was the europium. The good thing with the europium is that it's fluorescent on its own. So actually, we can follow the europium, which is part of the reaction, the mass transfer, to see how does the mass transfer develop. People study often mixing, adding tracers. In this case, we used one of the parts of the process, let's say, to see how quickly it evolves. So our working fluids is an aqueous phase with europium. It's a nitric acid solution, and an organic phase, which is kerosene, that will separate the europium from the aqueous phase. Now this is the setup. We have the laser, the camera, and the fluids coming from their pumps, and the mass transfer happening here. And some characteristics, details of the excitation and emission wavelength of the europium. So some results here. It took a bit of time. Again, thanks to Angeli. And Dr. Chaulidis. They managed to get results out of it. It was a bit more challenging than what we thought in the beginning. So we see here how this is for different velocities. So we see at a set position, they are all taken at a distance very close to the inlet of the channel. In the beginning, all the europium is in the aqueous phase, and when we start, and then at a certain distance from the beginning, some of it has transferred to the organic phase. So what we see here is that as we increase the velocity, at this set place, set position, we have, of course, less extraction because the residence time is less. Yeah, we try to follow that at various parts of further down the channel and to see how the mass transfer works. So this is important for us because we can find out mass transfer coefficient. And I think it's also very important for modelers to try to develop mass transfer models in two-phase systems because now they can have this sort of detailed data to compare the simulations. Some future plans, basically we are following all these lines of research in large, in coalescence and in small-scale flows and their applications. What, again, I want to show you is, again, some recent work we do, and just to link with the modelers that will follow up as a talk, is some work we have been doing also on stirred vessels. This is more traditional mixing, let's say, and there is work happening on how do you mix fluids and what's the effect of the impellers. What we are struggling with here is that we mix fluids that have very different viscosities, and in a way, they are like two-phase flows, okay? Because the diffusion takes so long to take over that the two fluids flow for quite some time as two separate as immiscible liquids. And what I want to show you here is that you can actually do quite a bit with both techniques. So this is some results on velocity fields we got with PIV. This is the same results, same conditions with the CFD. And in a way, the two things complemented each other. We managed to do the PIV experiments faster than we got the CFD results in this case. But actually, with the CFD, we managed to have a 3D view. This is 2D PIV, so we only see a plane. But with the CFD, we had, once we validated the CFD and we trusted it, then we could have a 3D view of the flow. So this is for both experiments and modeling working together and actually helping us understand the process and develop processes. Big thanks to all our researchers in the group. This is our current people. And to our funders, EPSRC for a lot of funding for this work, and Memphis Multiphase, a program grant that just finished, and we own a lot of the development of the techniques to the work that is done within here. I should mention this EU project because it's a newer work, but in that we look at the biofuels and how to go from waste oil to biofuels and support from companies. Thank you. I think we have to move around for issues.
So after this, after the experimental bit, so I hope it was a kind of a very good overview of what type of methods are being used for experimental multiphase flows. But of course, that was just a small snapshot, and we'll see more and more coming through the day. But most importantly, I think please do discuss, please do ask. So, so Giota is around today, and definitely make use of her expertise, and I'm sure there will be a lot of fruitful discussions. So, so obviously the last slide encapsulated the essence of the work. So when we do fluid dynamics, we look into at many different ways. One is experiments, and of course in terms of modeling, and of course in terms of theory as well. And so always the dream is that each one of them looks at the same stuff and has a complete match. And it's easier said than done. It's easier said than done because the way modeling comes through and the way experiments are done, they're quite in a different playing field. And obviously there is a lot of effort to make sure that they talk to each other, and at the same time the validation itself. So I'm sure Giota will agree, just to have one validation image, there's a lot of headache going on, okay, to make sure that we talk to each other. So basically, Aditya is going to give a small snapshot of what numerics and what analytical models can do, but of course, what do we want and what we cannot do as well.
So thanks, Prash, for the background. I hope I'm audible. I'm going to say that before joining Imperial as a postdoc, I was working for 5 years at CD Adapco, developing commercial CFD tools. So I have a purely simulation background. I think it helps for the purpose of this talk because at the end of the talk, I think what I'm trying to do here is generate a feed for discussions over the next couple of days, and perhaps we'll get a common terminology or lingo to talk between the modelers and the experimental people. I'm going to be conscious that I don't eat too much into your lunchtime, so it's going to be a general overview. A few disclaimers while the first slide is there. I'm not going to talk too much about the analytical side of things. I'm going to focus on my past experience with numerical modeling. And here I just wanted to set the tone for the talk by saying that what is the industry looking for? So in all of this perspective of experimentalists and modelers, I think the common ground perhaps comes from what is the real need from the industry. And I worked a bit on modeling of particulate flows and particularly fluidized bed applications, so I just used that as an example. What the industry is really looking forward to is scale up of their applications. So it's all good to do experiments at the lab scale, but the real question comes as how much of it applies when I use, say, a very large diameter fluidized bed reactor. And this is a common question that comes up. I think together we are trying to address these kind of issues. The other thing I think is topical or is relevant today is we want to optimize our design parameters. So I'm going to have a couple of slides to follow on the optimization part. And the argument I'm going to try to make is we also want to make the simulations faster. And that's kind of just the need of the day. So while we are talking about optimization, just wanted to show a couple of slides on what we think could be the future. So here we are trying to couple a typical CFD code. And in this case, we used OpenFOAM, open source code. We want to try to couple it to machine learning algorithms. And the idea really here is to get many iterations or an ensemble of simulations done in as short a time as possible. And just on the practical side, while we were communicating to people from the data science side, they would come to us and say that, can you make your simulation finish within a minute? And that's kind of blasphemous for the CFD side, where typically these simulations could even take like a month. But that's really the gap that we found out we need to bridge if we had to use these machine learning kind of algorithms. Having said that, what I'm trying to show here is each of the gray curves here, if you can see that, is basically one simulation in itself. We just set up a toy problem. So here we have one fluid trying to push out another fluid. So the red fluid here is trying to push out the blue fluid. And say, just to make things interesting, I put an objective that I want to minimize the amount of blue fluid in this pipe. And this is kind of a representative situation we try to come up with where your pipe can have multiple obstacles and you still want to flush out your blue fluid. So I'll just be quick on this. Suffices to say that we wanted to explore parameter space. So we wanted to explore, say, a range of Reynolds number for the fluid that's coming in. And we also want to try out different viscosity ratios, because typically in an FMCG industry, they would be trying to flush out, say, a toothpaste with water, and you can expect high viscosity ratios. So really what I wanted as the takeaway from this slide is each of the dots here is one simulation. If we could do enough of them, the machine learning algorithm is basically trying to point us to the point in parameter space where you get the minimum amount of the resident fluid. So this is just an example, and the tone I wanted to set is we also want to make our simulations quicker. So that's kind of an issue on the modeling side that we need to deal with. So having said that, this is quite a cliched slide, and I realize that there are a lot of modeling people here, so this is like preaching the converted, but what does a typical modeling setup involve? And I wanted to still put it out there so that, you know, this is essentially the bare bones of the modeling procedure. I would talk a bit about the choice of modeling approaches in the next couple of slides. I think that's important. So it all starts by choosing a framework in which you want to do the modeling, especially involving multi-phase flows. You need to make choices like, do I track my droplets or bubbles in a Lagrangian sense, or do I average the information out and use like two fluid models? So that's some of the choices we need to make a priori. Having made the choices for the modeling approach, we set out the partial differential equations, and I think there's also this subtle point about what are the assumptions we already made in the modeling, and that needs to be a clear communication, I think, between the experimental people and the modeling people on what are the assumptions inherent, say, to the modeling approach, so that when we are measuring the similar quantities in the experiments, we know we are comparing apples to apples. And I'm thinking a lot about Eulerian models where there's a lot of averaging going on and implicit in the modeling technique itself. And when we want to compare, say, to experiments, we expect that the quantities are averaged, say, in a similar sense, which is kind of subtle but tricky. The obvious thing is we would require information on the geometry as complete as possible, and just wanted to highlight the typical issue with boundary conditions here, especially to do with inlets. So as modelers, we always like to reduce the size of our computational domain, and sometimes we do periodic simulations, assuming that the inlet is far away and it doesn't play a major role. But I think that's something we can talk to the experimentalists and really ask, like, did you see an effect of the inlet on the processes downstream, and how long did it take before the inlet effects disappeared? All these are important considerations to choose the domain of your simulations. The other things that modelers require sometimes as inputs really is what was the contact angle of the interface at the walls, and this is again kind of not easy perhaps to get on the experimental side, but that's again a quantity that we need as a boundary condition in the models sometimes. And then I think we touched upon this topic in the last talk that we need to be sure that the probing techniques that were used in the experiments didn't actually play an active role in the results that you get. If they did, we better include them in our simulation setup. And lastly, we obviously need to communicate in terms of non-dimensional numbers. That's typically what we would do. So here, basically, I am showing, I'm sorry, the image somehow got cut, but basically I'm showing a regime map. And the idea is that there is no single modeling approach that applies to the whole of the regime map. So if, for example, we want to do stratified smooth or stratified wavy flows, we can resort to techniques like volume of fluid or level set or front tracking, which work at their best when the two phases are separated. On the other hand, if the two phases are mixed, we would resort to Eulerian kind of techniques. So it's quite an important consideration to start with, that what do we expect to get out of this simulation? And it's kind of a chicken and egg simulation, because unless you simulate, you don't know what regime you predicted. But I think here is where the experiments could set the tone, take the lead, so to say, and kind of tell us that this is what you expect to get from this simulation. Especially, I think, in the context of volume of fluid methods, it's probably a good idea to know what kind of droplet sizes or bubble sizes were kind of seen in the experiment. It's good to know because this technique actually depends on resolving those interfaces. So sometimes you just know a priori that it's almost impossible to get those kind of droplet sizes using, say, the volume of fluid technique, and then you better resort to Eulerian kind of approach. So I think these are important communication points between the modelers and the experimentalists. Okay, so I'm going to kind of sum up what I said regarding the modeling approach, as these are the different choices typically that we have for multi-phase flows, and there could be others. So I'm kind of limited by my previous experience and just trying to give a flavor. And then there is the question of how much resolution you throw in the simulation. Okay, so what I was trying to do here is for people with purely experimental background, just set the tone as to what are the choices a modeler makes. Now, one of the major choices is about how much of the flow I resolve. And I'm giving an example of spatial resolution. That's kind of easy to imagine. But when I say level of detail, it could also be the order of the model. So you can think of reduced order modeling techniques as something going down the chain here, where you kind of reduce the number of degrees of freedom, essentially, in your system. And what I wanted to say is the two can be connected in different ways. So these are really two independent choices in some sense, that you choose a modeling approach, then you choose a level of detail that you want to resolve, and the two get married. So that's typically how you get your simulation setup. So if I had to sum up the message I kind of wanted to come out of this presentation, it's probably in this slide, that at the highest level of resolution, which is the direct numerical simulations, the only hand-holding I could have as a modeler are the experiments. So if I had to validate my DNS, and that is basically the name of the game, so I should have said upfront that all of this is about trying to validate the CFD codes. And so if I had to validate a DNS code, I would do it against the experiments. And I think that's really the space where a lot of work is done, and I'll show a few slides about how it was done in some of the previous work at Imperial as part of Memphis. And then I would talk about the RANS modeling, which is basically a very coarse way of modeling things. And the LES basically falls somewhere in between. And you would see that the typical strategy that is employed is once you have a validated DNS model, it's quite handy because the DNS model itself provides you wealth of simulation data that you can use now to basically validate your other techniques. So sometimes for the LES and the RANS approaches, you do not actually need to directly compare with experiment. I should kind of rephrase, it's not like you do not need to, but typically people would resort to comparing them with similar DNS studies. But I'm also going to argue that DNS has its own limitations in terms of the parameter space that you can cover. So you might end up in this catch-22 kind of situation that you cannot actually do a DNS for a real problem, but you still want to validate your, say, RANS or LES model. And that's when you, again, need to marry RANS or LES with experiments directly. So, that's the kind of situation we are stuck in. So I'm going to give a few examples now. So this is direct numerical simulations being compared with experiment. So that was the first bullet point I made on the last slide. And the Memphis project, which was a 5-year project and a collaboration between Imperial, Nottingham, Birmingham, UCL, is a big collaboration. I think the main ethos of that project was this, basically, that you can do very detailed DNS simulations with almost no or very low level of empiricism embedded in them, and then you can compare them with equivalent experiments. So this is an example of the work done as part of the Memphis project. So this is a microfluidic junction. You have an organic phase coming into an aqueous phase, and the message really is that we observed certain shapes of these droplets. They could be plugs, they could be jets, and then we see similar kind of topology in the experiments. Moreover, we are able to look at the velocity fields inside the dispersed phase and also compare it to the experiment. So this is actually work carried out between UCL and Birmingham. And this is a nice example of a successful collaboration between experiments and modeling. So I would look at this slide as an example of a successful validation. And then another example, this time coming from a different framework. So earlier there was this hybrid level set front tracking approach for the slide I showed before. Here we have used the Eulerian Lagrangian approach. It means that the background phase was solved in an Eulerian sense, whereas the particles are tracked in a Lagrangian sense. And I think the key points I wanted to highlight here is, if as a modeler I want to set up this kind of simulation, what information would I need from, say, the experimental side? So I need to know what is the Reynolds number of this background fluid, and that's more to do with the separation of scales that I expect to see in the background phase. So it's very important for, particularly for this simulation, to know what the particle sizes are as non-dimensionalized by the Kolmogorov length scale. And the reason that is important is because in the modeling I used an assumption that my particles do not affect the background fluid. I could make that assumption only if my particles are very small and also the loading of the particles is quite small. So these two assumptions better get mapped to the experiments. So this is an example I wanted to give where there has to be clear communication between the experiment and the simulation, and that needs to be checked a priori. And some of the other non-dimensional numbers we need to match are like the particle Stokes number. Now, I also wanted to talk about what are the typical outputs that are generated from such a detailed simulation, I would say. So we obviously get the qualitative idea of the dispersion of the particles, and we are able to compare that to experiment by using something called the radial distribution function. It gives an idea of the spatial length scales at which these particles are separated. But more importantly, I wanted to point out that the DNS simulation is actually resulting in a wealth of data, like the cross correlation between the particle and fluid velocities, and correlations between, say, the particle number density at a local point in space with the fluid strain rate in the background. And the reason some of these correlations are important is if I resorted to a RANS kind of modeling approach, that is a coarse modeling approach, just on paper I'll see all of these correlations arising in my governing equations. And these would be unclosed terms for the RANS model. And we think one of the ways to close those models is using data from the DNS. So this is all good on the modeling side. We would use the DNS as a numerical test bed to develop our RANS models. But we wish that we are able to also validate some of these cross correlations from the experimental side. And I think that's where the challenges are. So I also wanted to point out some of the areas where we need to kind of talk more to the experimental people to generate kind of cross correlations of quantities like these. Now, the issue with those kind of measurements, as I understand, is in a real world, you have finite size bubbles or droplets, and you cannot ask for the velocity of the background phase exactly where your particle or bubble is. So, you run into these practical considerations, and these are kind of areas I think we need to work more on as to what is exactly the quantity we can match between the simulation and the experiments. So on that, I should also mention that in the modeling, we use the assumption of point particles, which is quite convenient on the modeling side, so that we can talk about velocities of the fluid and the particle at the same point, but obviously it's not practical in the experimental side. So things like these need to be discussed.
So the chemical engineering is thinking, yeah, we can get onto length scales and Stokes numbers and things, but the chemist in me is saying that a lot of times we can't measure these things, especially if we've got chemical dynamics happening, particles are growing in solid liquid phases. Does that then stop doing in simulations, or are there any compromises?
So I think your question alludes to if there are mass transfer processes going on top of this. And there are obviously modeling approaches where that can be taken into account. I wouldn't hazard talking in detail about that side because we didn't actually work on these kind of evaporating droplets. But I'm aware of literature on that side. And again, I would be very careful in looking at the assumptions that were inherent to the modeling there, so that just so that we know that what are we talking about when we want to compare with the experiment. But there are modeling techniques. They will come with their limitations. And I think the idea is just to know what those limitations are to start with. Yeah. Right, so these were a couple of examples of DNA simulations. And then I wanted to go to the other end, like how much information or utility is there to these RANS kind of approaches. And again, I'm playing safe really here. I'm showing some of the work I did previously on modeling of fluidized bed reactors. And again, I'm thinking about what are the inputs I needed to set up this kind of simulation. And some of the thorny issues could be like, in the modeling, I need to know the coefficient of restitution when two of these particles collide. It goes in as an input in this Eulerian approach. And I'm thinking that for lack of any information from the experimental side, I would probably be just left to play around with a few values and then see how that changes my results. But I think to bring in more kind of a rigorous approach, we need these kind of quantities to be reported from the experiment and then plugged into the model. Otherwise, I think modelers basically end up using this as a free parameter to tune the results, which doesn't make too much sense in that case. The other inputs that are required are pretty typical, and I think I talked about them before, like the geometry and the boundary conditions. So just wanted to show quickly a few results that we could get from this kind of approach. And the question is, again, what could we compare to the experiment? So in this case, it could be as simple as comparing the initial expansion of this fluidized bed. And obviously, we are interested in the distribution of solids. So the way we end up comparing is start with a qualitative comparison. So this is an example where we found an equivalent experiment of a fluidized bed with an obstacle. And then we used two different modeling approaches. So remember I said that these are choices to be made, and that literally is the case in case of fluidized bed simulations. So people sometimes prefer to use this Lagrangian approach called the discrete element method, again, which comes with its own assumptions. So here, each of the particles that you see is not a real particle. It's supposedly an ensemble of real particles treated in the same way. So immediately you start to see that the results from the simulation are a function of the assumptions made while setting up the simulation. And then we have the Eulerian models, which come with their own assumptions. And one of the things that we need to do to set up the Eulerian simulations is specify the drag between the two phases. And what I see around is we still use drag laws which are applicable to spheres and somehow modify them while using them in the simulation. So I just wanted to highlight some of the empiricism that's inherent to the modeling techniques. But I think here what we are trying to look at is how do we validate these kind of models. And this is a qualitative way of validating the simulations. Again, this is an example of a qualitative comparison. So we could do not only monodispersed particles in a bed. This is an example of having a polydispersed mixture. It could be typical in the pharmaceutical industry where you have particles of different sizes. And what we are interested in looking is where do different size particles preferentially reside. And we could again compare that to experiments. So again, this is an example of a qualitative comparison. I'm going to show a couple of slides on quantitative comparison in the same context. So this is an example where gas is injected into a fluidized bed, and in the experiment they basically monitored the size of the gas bubble that develops. So this is gas injected into a packed bed, and we can compare the size of this bubble with what we get in the simulations. So that's one of the quantitative ways to validate your model. And then this is for the same example of particles in a mixer. We could be looking at the velocity field and comparing that with experiment. There is one particular interesting case we did, and this is part of a challenge problem set up by NETL in the US. They do this every 3 years or so to benchmark the CFD codes. And the idea here is they would give you all the information you require to set up your simulation. They would have done an experiment a priori, but they wouldn't tell you the results of the experiment. So it's like a blind challenge problem. And I think that turns out to be a good example of what we are trying to discuss here. So I think the people there did a good job of specifying everything that we require to set up the simulation. And we ended up comparing a few quantities, one of them being the pressure drop across this bed. And we are quite glad that when we compared it to the experimental value, which was eventually told to us, we found quite a good match. So I think problems like these or challenge problem exercises are really useful because then we tend to get back to these guys who set up this problem and ask them all the questions that we can so that we can set up a representative equivalent simulation. So I thought this was a very good exercise, and we also ended up comparing the velocities of the particles. So again, these are average velocities within the bed, and we are looking at the vertical velocity as well as the horizontal velocity, which tells a bit about the flow structure or circulations going on in this fluidized bed. And again, we could compare that to the experiment. And obviously, we see that we don't get an exact match, which leaves space to discuss all of the assumptions we did in the modeling, like the drag law we used or the coefficient of restitution we used. And that basically, for us, becomes the area of improvement. But again, I think those areas could improve if there is kind of more communication with the experimental side. All right, so I wanted to, towards the end, talk about turbulence modeling a bit because that's something we are looking at right now. And I think it's kind of topical to this audience. So in the context of fluidized beds, we realize that we are talking about fluctuations of particle velocities at the level of individual particles, but there are also fluctuations associated with a cluster of particles. And these fluctuations are typically what you see on the right-hand side could be characterized by the typical turbulent kinetic energy that we talk about, say, in K epsilon kind of models. So we realize that for granular flows, there could be a scale separation, and people are working on developing models as to how these fluctuations communicate with each other. And the reason I brought this up is we noticed that if we had to predict the distribution of solids in our fluidized bed, So this is like going from the center of the bed towards the wall. Unless we incorporated this kind of a turbulence model for the particle phase, and this is on top of the granular flow model that was already there, we could not even qualitatively match our results, which tells us that, okay, there was something majorly missing in the modeling previously. And now we are asking the question, how can we close these terms that arise in the K epsilon kind of models or the Reynolds average model? So that's what I wanted to kind of bring up. And on that note, I wanted to talk about the need for measuring perhaps all of the components of the Reynolds stress tensor that arises when we do these RANS kind of models. So this kind of ties into the very beginning of my presentation where I said that we need our simulations to be quicker. So I think we are caught in this situation where ideally DNS is a very good test bed to compare with experiments. All sounds good, but if you wanted your simulations to be quicker, you might end up practically resorting to these Reynolds average kind of models. And we are looking at a particular example here of air-water stratified flow. And this is just a literature survey at this point, so to say. So what we noticed is the best K epsilon kind of approaches that we are aware of right now have not been able to predict the velocities of the phases in this stratified flow, especially in the region close to the interface. And we think there is a big hole here that needs to be plugged in. So the K epsilon models basically need more hand-holding or improvement to improve predictions in this kind of regime. And so what happens experimentally in this kind of flows is you have these secondary flows typically, and that's kind of a schematic of what the experimental people would observe. And it's kind of obvious that close to the interface, conditions are not isotropic. So the flow is seeing the interface more or less like a wall. And we know a priori that using a K epsilon kind of approach is perhaps not going to work because there is no isotropy in the flow in that region. And that leads us to the question of, can we measure the anisotropy in the flow close to such an interface? And I think that's kind of comes out as a message when we look at the outputs from these K epsilon models. Having said that, I also put this slide to highlight that it's actually a quite handy experimental database that was provided way back in 1987. And the experiments have already reported quantities like the turbulent kinetic energy that we end up measuring or we are able to measure from the simulations. So I think this is quite a handy experimental database, and there is already an opportunity for models to improve and benchmark themselves against these kind of databases. Having said that, the experimental database at the moment only reports the cross correlation between the normal velocity and the streamwise velocity at the interface. And I know it's kind of a luxury for a modeler to ask for it, but we are saying that if we had information on the other cross correlations, that would help us perhaps to build the entire Reynolds stress tensor that we could use for these RANS kind of models. So I think in my mind, on the turbulence modeling space, those are the kind of improvements that we are looking for. Yeah.
In those cases, right, there's an interface in the middle, which is deformable. How could you actually consider the turbulence closer to the interface exactly?
So that's a good question. I mean, at the higher flow rates of, say, the gas phase, we see a very wavy or jagged interface. That's right. And I think for the models, it will perhaps be a good idea to look at a unit wave, say, and I'm just speculating here. But what we want to know is what happens at, say, the crest of this wave, and how different is that from the trough of the wave, and is as much information as we can get about these kind of things that we can then plug in into the model.
I think it is a way of the way new type of subgrid models, or is it resolved itself?
So you think the question is on the modeling side?
Deformable interface, when the deformable interface exists.
Yeah.
How could you? What do you think? I don't know the answer. I'm an experimentalist, but.
So you're right. If we had enough resolution in the simulation, we could actually predict what happens in that region with the models we presently have. I think the question still then remains as to how do I know if my subgrid models are doing well? And in fact, to design the subgrid model itself would need some kind of hand-holding because we are thinking here that the turbulent viscosity or the subgrid viscosity is tapering down as we approach the interface. But it would have been handy if we knew how that exactly happens, so that at the end of the day, the subgrid models are also kind of built up, and then we need kind of more information on improving these models, really. So I think people have thrown in the typical models so far. One of the issues is resolution, which can be handled already. But the other issue is, I think, about validating these subgrid models close to the interface. And I'm thinking we have already information, say, for example, on the turbulent shear stress here. But it's just that if we had more information on the other direction, it would perhaps help development of these models. But in the literature, we notice there is a hole to be plugged in to improve these kind of models.
Just to add on to that, most of these modeling methods, these simulations, the interface is never sharp. It always has some kind of a thickness, whether we like it or not.
Not really. If you
can have a sharp
oil system, the interface is
No, I'm talking about the modeling side. From the modeling side, the interface we described, though we want it to be as sharp as possible, it has a Gaussian or it has a kind of a tangent function. So it is not exactly sharp. You can make it as sharp as possible. There are methods to do that, but that involves a lot of numerical instability, which is another game later. And so we always grapple with the subgrid information even close to the interface. Though we, as we rightly pointed out, that we can get as much information as possible, but I think we need a lot of hand-holding from experiments just to see what is happening at that point, or if my modeling is actually relevant at that point.
So on the experimental side, and David would agree with me on this one, what we can get is velocity vectors with the resolution that's possible, isn't it? Yeah.
So,
is this my favorite class actually?
Yeah, we can discuss more over lunch. I think the other issue is about seeing where the interface exactly is, and even that needs to be compared. So I have just a very quick last slide where I just sum up everything that I said so far. And I think the main point really was we need as much details about the experimental setup as possible. We are trying to make our simulations run faster, and if we had to do that, we end up needing information on more complex quantities. But the perspective is, if we had that kind of information, we could perhaps validate our coarse models, and that's perhaps a way for the future. So I think with that, I'll just thank the work I presented here partly was part of Memphis, and I worked at CD Adapco, which is now Siemens. Yeah, thank you.
Lunch, right? Lunch is at the back, and I would like to welcome Mark Valluri and Brian Anderson, who have just right.
Asking for the presentations.
Yes. Who's the next one?
Me.
Oh.
But I need all